Good afternoon, this is Wilfred Owen's exposure analysis. So this poem is set in the First World War. It makes reference to the cold winter of 1917. Wilfred Owen's poetry was shocking and realistic, and it stood in contrast to both public perception of war and the patriotic and romantic poetry of the early war. In this poem, Owen shows the fate of soldiers who perished from hypothermia in this winter, how their death took long, both in a psychological and in a physical time and place, and how this develops a boredom and a delusional state in the soldiers and how they have to go through it. The topic of this poem is the futility of war and nature as an enemy, and the author is willing to make the reader take the place of a soldier in this context and to get to build a sort of a mental and sensitive point of view based on a soldier that is fighting in the war. So the futility of war and nature as an enemy is portrayed in exposure through the use of personification, essence, rhyme, imagery, and religious reference. There are three main topics that I will develop in this analysis. The first is how the real enemy in war is nature and its elements. Second, how war can kill a man in a psychological way. And third, how war can lead to loss of faith in God and how God is responsible for the suffering caused by nature. These are the three main topics that Owen also covers in his poem. So, yeah. First off, in war, the real enemy is nature or its elements. So this is established from the very first verse in the first stanza by the use of personification when he says, "Merciless iced east winds that knife us." In here he suggests that the wind is vindictive, it doesn't have any compassion for them, and using knife which is a violent verb, implying that this is that wind is an attacker, meaning that he is portraying from the very beginning the personality of the wind, of the weather, as an enemy. In this same quote, he uses the S sound as a sibilant hissing combined with hard consonants such as Z and T, creating a cut sound, which relate to the knifing of the men. In the second stanza, he uses more personification for the weather, saying, "We hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire." And afterwards, in the second verse, saying, "Like twitching agonies of men among its brambles." Now he uses a simile for the reader to create this this horrific image of the wind causing the barbed wire to twitch like dying men, so they can so the reader can relate to the idea of the weather being as dangerous and as malevolent as the possible enemies in the war. In the third stanza, he again uses personification, saying, "Dawn massing in the east her melancholy army attacks once more in ranks and shivering ranks of grey." In here, he personifies the dawn as a wary female war commander, and relates the colors of the clouds and of the environment with the German army uniforms, which were gray at the time, making again that connection with the enemy and showing how the weather is ready to attack. In the fourth stanza, he uses personification once more, and how, saying, "Flakes that flock, pause and renew the wind's nonchalance." In this stanza, he shows how the snowflakes can appear to make a conscious decision about where they will settle, meaning that they know who they will attack, in this case the soldiers, giving them a personality and this human attribute of deciding and having control over themselves. In the fifth stanza, he again uses personification, saying pale flakes with lingering still come feeling for our faces. This again gives the flakes human attributes, which gives them the capability of inflicting this pain to the soldiers. So collectively, the personified elements of this winter are as much an enemy on the attack as the Germans are pretty much in this war. Going to the second topic, how can war can kill a man in a psychological, if not a physical way. Going to the third stanza, the use of personification when saying the poignant misery of Don begins to grow. And here Don only brings another day of poignant misery, meaning that for the soldiers it is a constant cycle of suffering and misery as the days go by. He also uses assonance with the O sound in the second verse. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, alluding to that cry for help or of pain, drawing out the painful process of awakening in Don. In the fourth stanza, making reference to the personification mentioned before, it can mean the psychological decadence of the soldiers by giving the weather and its elements human attributes, getting to the point of that psychological decadence that they need to recur and allude to that type of resources to defend themselves from another enemy. This is also portrayed in the rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme of the poem is ABBAC. So Owen's use of parirhyme makes that the sounds create this harmony and challenge the expectation of the reader. But while using a regular pattern of ABBA, creates a sense of stillness and the cycle that I was talking about previously. So nothing changes, and in the rhyming pattern, nothing happens, as well as nothing happens in the front, in the trenches. The last verse of all the stanzas, putting them together, create one message, one poem itself, showing how this this mental cycle keeps controlling the soldier. So it says, but nothing happens. What are we doing here? Is it that we're dying? We turn back to our dying, for our love of God is dying. So these all create this cycle that represent this psychological nothingness that the soldiers are in, and the loss of the meaning of being in the war. Finally, going to the last theme of how war can lead to a loss of faith in God and how God is responsible for the suffering caused by nature. This is mainly portrayed in the two last stanzas, in the seventh and the eighth stanza. In the seventh stanza, in the third verse, when Owen says, "For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid," meaning the spring that God will make follow this harsh winter the soldiers are going through, frightens them as they feel like they won't be able to see it. They won't be alive for that moment. And in the fifth verse of this stanza, for love of God seems dying, meaning that God's love for them is in doubt, and their faith in Him has also been affected due to the war. This creates like a parallelism between like a parallel meaning between the lost in their faith in God and their lost in the patriotic sense of war they had. And in the last stanza, finally, God's image is shown as the cause of everything. So I'll read the stanza real quick. Tonight his frost will fasten on this mud and us, shriveling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in their shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are eyes, but nothing happens. So in the first 4 verses, Owen portrays how God's frost will freeze everything. He makes reference to God when he says his in capital letter. The burial parties are, the soldiers will see all of those who died of exposure of that creation of God, while nothing in particular was happening in the war. So they all died because of something that God made and not something that man made. This leading to the seeming of indifference of God about the situation that the men are living in that point, and also showing how these wounds are way more dangerous and deadlier than the wounds caused by the bullets and other guns in the war. So basically, this is how through the poem Owen creates in the reader the image of the reality of war. He uses personification, assonance, rhyme, imagery, and religious preference to show how the futility of war and nature as an enemy, and this all caused because of God. And because of this, he can also criticize the abandonment of the people and of God for them, leaving them in the hands of nature.